Good afternoon, everybody. Ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, dear colleagues. Let me first introduce myself. I am Khalil Atiya. I'm the director of SPARAC, which is the center under Barcelona Convention UNAP-MAP in charge of marine biodiversity and specially protected areas. Little precision, this center is established in Tunis. So today is the COP27 Biodiversity Day, the day where to think of both together, nature restoration and climate safety, to think of how to achieve the very ambitious global biodiversity goal of 30 by 30, which means 30% conservation of ecosystems by 2030, under the exacerbating overall threat of climate change. And our session now is in the heart of this issue. It deals with restoration of ecosystem in the Mediterranean. And the question is it a key tool to limit or reverse the progress of climate change impacts? Mrs. Tatiana Hema, coordinator of UN Environment Mediterranean Action Plan Barcelona Convention, dear participants, dear colleagues, let me first express my gratitude to UFM Secretariat for coordinating and making possible for the first time the Mediterranean Pavilion. Together with the Prima Foundation and UNAP-MAP, and raising the visibility of the Mediterranean, which is, as we all know, among most affected areas by climate change. I would also like to thank our speakers who are in present partly, but also online, who participate in this side event to share their knowledge and expertise on restoration, which is now recognized as among key means to raise resilience against climate change. Dear participants, dear colleagues, one of the most significant changes in recent history is transformed the relationship between humans and their environment. And now, we all realize that natural systems are precious and limited, and thus are changing our values and attitude toward the world around us. Now we are witnessing higher awareness about how our behaviors and actions can degrade the health and integrity of sensitive and valuable ecosystems. One response to this is, of course, to prevent ecological damage in the first place. The other possible answer is ecological restoration, to repair what damage has occasioned. Actually, we are facing a triple dimension planetary crisis, which is climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. Conserving what's left of nature is not enough. Restoration looks like one of key solutions to the climate crisis, as restoration marine natural degraded ecosystems, in particular those with the highest potential to remove and store carbon, such as the Posidonia meadows, could reduce the impact linked to global warming. Even with the significant decrease in CO2 and other greenhouse gases, the IPCC report makes it clear that many of the effects of climate change will be seen and felt over the ensuing decades, and that many of them are practically irreversible. This means hotter temperatures, sea level rise, sea water salinity rise, longer drought periods, more frequent extreme events, and unpredictable weather events will increasingly become the norm. This side event objective is to discuss whether restoration should be considered as key tool to limit or reverse the progress of climate change impacts, as the viability of ecological restoration could be strongly compromised by accelerated environmental modification associated with climate change. What should be then considered as priority? To recover what is lost, or to prevent or to preserve what remains, or maybe a balanced solution in between. To this end, we will have 4 presentations today. The first one gives an overview of the restoration of ecosystems and species within the framework of Barcelona Convention. The 3 other presentations are online. The speakers will try to contribute through data and case studies sharing to give answers to the question whether restoration should be considered as a key tool to limit or reverse the progress of climate change and its effects. But first, I will give the floor to Mrs. Tatiana Hema, UNEP-MAP coordinator, for her opening speech. Please, Tatiana. You have 5 minutes.
Yeah, I know. Thank you very much. I'm even less a little because I delayed. Thank you very much, dear Khalil, dear participants, dear colleagues. I'm very glad to be with you today, and I'm going to be very short because I think that the most important is to hear a little bit from scientists and technical people on how climate change, biodiversity, ecosystem restoration really can influence and for us to overcome the crisis that we are talking about. One of the main facts emphasized by the report on the environmental development that we issued in 2020 under the leadership of Plan Bleu, but with the participation of many partners and MAP components, is that climate change is already affecting Mediterranean, and Mediterranean is a hotspot of climate change. I think that there is plenty of evidence in different side events with a lot of arguments why this has happened, so I'm not taking your time in repeating them. But the truth is that considering the intensity of climate focusing, increased temperature, precipitation decrease, sea level rise, seawater acidification, extreme events increase, non-climate forcing population growth, including tourist arrival. We know very well that what tourism is for the Mediterranean, vulnerability and exposure of issues of major importance, land cover, population density, economic activities, heritage sites. The Mediterranean basin is really altogether a climate change hotspot. Now, what is our response? Very difficult. However, the contracting parties to the Barcelona Convention recently, last year, they took a very important decision, deciding on a, we call it SABIO, which is a programmatic strategy for the Mediterranean, for the protection and conservation of biodiversity. And it's a very important document because it aligns the Mediterranean region with a global target and global commitment, the so-called post-2020 CBD strategic framework, and definitely equip the region to take the necessary measures in order to bend the biodiversity loss curve, but also to consider climate change fully in its work. Now, I'm reading for your information one of the targets of the SABIO. It's a bit long, but it's important because you can see that the contracting parties to the Barcelona Convention, they already put together those elements that I just mentioned. So by 2030, all countries have adopted and started implementing short and medium-term measures for climate change mitigation and adaptation, particularly to warming, acidification, and contributing to disaster risk reduction through reducing emission, applying nature-based solutions, ecosystem-based approaches, and restoration as appropriate, ensuring resilience and minimize any negative impact on biodiversity, thereby also contributing to halt global warming and acidification. And to develop by 2027 the full inventory of ecosystems with highest ecological relevance and regeneration potential, and by 2030 to complete the restoration of most of those selected. It's very ambitious. It's very ambitious, but our contracting parties are also very ambitious. We follow also the global trend, and luckily we also have the capacity in the region and through the UNEP-MAP Barcelona Convention that with the support of the SPARAC that has been offered to the region by the government of Tunisia, but for many, many years working now to support contracting parties, and with all partners' collaboration, I believe that we will be in a position to support our contracting parties to achieve these very important targets. Now, let me say some words because Khalil explained what is the purpose of this side event. We do believe that this side event with the presentation that are going to be made will provide more feedback and more elements or solution on how biodiversity and crisis and climate crisis can be overcome together. So we cannot look at them in an isolated way, but there are solutions and there are ways to make sure that really we can work in a way that we can address both in an integrated way, because they are already very much integrated. Bending the curve of biodiversity loss and the ambition to maintain, restore and protect natural ecosystems is difficult, as I just said, but not impossible. So it is important, but they cannot be achieved if climate change impact are not taken into consideration. So those elements are very important, and definitely there is still a lot to know, and we are going to invest in knowing more what are the impacts and the linkages, but definitely the most important is to act. So I thank you very much, and I look forward to a very interesting discussion during this side event. Thank you.
Thank you, Tatiana, for your encouraging speech. And now I will give the floor for the first speaker, who is Mr. Atif Urghi, the program officer in charge of ecosystem and habitats in SPARAC. And he will give a presentation about restoration of ecosystems and species within Barcelona Convention.
Okay, thank you. So I will try to be brief, but also to explain what Mrs. Tatiana said concerning the role of the UNEP-MAP in equipping the region with the necessary legal and strategic document to face the issue of the climate change. So, but as she said, the Mediterranean region is always in line with what is happening at a global level, and I think they forget to mention that UN has declared the 2021 to 2030 the UN decade for restoration of ecosystem, and this is really an important challenge at the global level. And it is not only the role of a country or a region or an organization. Is a tremendous work that there is a need for collaboration, and the Mediterranean region, with the collaboration existing through the Barcelona Convention, could help in the global effort. So the science is clear, and we have now proof that the next 10 years are paramount in the fight to avert climate change and the loss of nature biodiversity, and we are now have proof that climate change is impacting the Mediterranean biodiversity. We are experiencing change in native species distribution, with warm water species that are increasing in abundance and also extending their range northward. There is a decrease also in the abundance of some cold water species from most northerly area of the Mediterranean. We are facing also a spread of non-indigenous species in the Mediterranean. We are now, we have about 1,000 non-indigenous species in the region, with almost 100 that are proven to be invasive to the ecosystem, but also to the health of the human. And the number is growing from year to year, and the most impacted region are the oriental part of the Mediterranean, but also the northern part due to maritime traffic. We also seen during several other side events that we are experiencing also a mass mortality of macrobenthic community, and it is becoming frequent. We have documented more than 30 hard bottom species that have been affected by mass mortality event associated with unusual increase in seawater temperature. And the last one was during 2021, and you see the last publication on that issue related to marine heat wave as driver to recurrent mass mortality in the Mediterranean. Also, we are experiencing effect of acidification. So we have reduction in calcification rate, reduction in growth, and increased necrosepsis of some calcareous organism. Effect also of the sea level rise on some species, for example, for habitat for marine turtle, the loss of their nesting beach, but also the temperature affect the population dynamic, as their sex is determined by temperature, and we are experiencing more female than male in caused by the increasing of temperature. But also we have the vermeted reams that are also vulnerable to water level, and this is one of the monuments that should be protected at Mediterranean level. There's a lot of those vermeted in the oriental part. But as Mrs. Tatiana said, the Mediterranean region has the chance to have the Barcelona Convention that was established in 1975. We have the same age now. And it is complemented by thematic protocol, and in particular the SPA-BD protocol, which deal with the protection of biodiversity through the establishment of specially protected area in the region. And this protocol was adopted in 95 after the amendment of the Barcelona Convention and the amendment of the SPA protocol, taking into account all the outcome of the Rio de Janeiro summit. The concept of the sustainable development, the protection of biodiversity from gene to species, and entered into force in 1999. Its two main objectives are the protection of area of particular natural or cultural value by the establishment and management of specially protected area, but also what we call the SPAMI, the Specially Protected Area of Mediterranean Importance. And this is category of protected area, what we call the SPAMI, is an important tool, in particularly because it allows the protection of the high sea, which is a sort of innovative tool at the time when this protocol entered into force. And this is an overview of the MPA system in the Mediterranean. It was evaluated in 2020, and we are not far away from the objective of 10% of the protection. We were at 8 0.35% of the surface of the Mediterranean protected. And the problem is that the system is, there is a geographical imbalance. There is a more protected area in the northern part of the Mediterranean. Several representative ecosystems are not protected by those MPAs. But we know that MPA increase ecosystem resilience, so there is a need to do more on that direction to allow the resilience of ecosystem, but also to serve as sentinel site to better understand the reaction to climate change. And also MPA can be a tool for carbon sequestration when it protects the Posidonian meadows, and we know exactly the importance of this ecosystem in the region. So the other, let's say, objective of the protocol is the protection and conservation of threatened and endangered species and their habitat. The protocol have several provisions to protect species and to maintain them in a favorable state of conservation. And there's a two list of species, the Annex 2 list of endangered threatened species, where the country are obliged to give them the most appropriate protection. And Annex 2, the list of species whose exploitation should be regulated at national level too. So the question till now, what we are doing is conservation, conserving habitat, conserving species. But is conservation protection is enough to maintain ecosystem species in a favorable state of conservation, which is the main objective of the protocol? Yes. So as Mrs. Tadani had, we have two new documents that were adopted. The first one is the post-2020 sub-bio with the vision to, by 2050, marine and coastal biodiversity is valued, conserved, and restored, and wisely used. And it has three goals. One of them, in order to reduce the threat to biodiversity, we should work on ecosystem health and restoration through nature-based solution. So for reaching that goal, there's two targets. The first one is on ecosystem restoration. So the country are committed to, by 2027, to develop a full inventory of ecosystem with the highest ecological relevance and or regeneration. And by 2030 to complete the restoration of those that we will select. Is in line with the EU new law on restoration, where the member states have to restore at least 20% of EU lands and sea by 2030, and all ecosystem in need of restoration by 2050. But also there is another, on climate change, another target, which is by 2030, all countries, as was said before, have to adopt and start implementing short and medium-term measure through nature-based solution, ecosystem-based approach, and restoration as appropriate. And this is a tricky part. This document, the sub-bio, was also complemented by a post-regional strategy of marine and coastal MPA and OCMs, and the objective is to protect by 2030 at least 30% of the Mediterranean Sea, but with a system of MPA connected, ecologically representative, and well managed. And also the number coverage should be enhanced. Okay, so there's a lot of questions that we start to pose because we are starting to work on restoration. So the question that raised when we start to work, for example, on Pinna nobilis, are conservation and restoration equally important? Must restoration be undertaken in parallel to the application of conservation measure? or also do we have knowledge on the effect of climate change on the success of restoration? And thank you.
Thank you, Atif, for this reminder in terms of legal frameworks and strategic frameworks for biodiversity conservation. So now we have our first speaker online, who is Mrs. Monica Montifalcone. She's a researcher in the Department of Earth, Environmental and Life Sciences at the University of Genoa. And she will give us an idea about restoration of marine ecosystems with an overview of experiences in the Mediterranean and at global level. So Monica, you have 8 minutes to give us this overview. Thank you. You have the floor.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Attia. Do you hear me well? Yes. Great. I'm gonna share my screen. Okay. Do you see my full screen now? Okay, thank you. So thanks again. I'm very glad to be here with you. And as already introduced,
yes,
I'm gonna...
Yes, perfect. Go ahead.
Oh, great. So I'm gonna briefly make an overview about the main examples of restoration activities carried out in the Mediterranean Sea, and mostly in the northwestern part of the Mediterranean Sea, because actually this is the side of our basin mostly affected by habitat degradation and species loss. So we have just seen before that we are a little bit far from the achievement of the global targets asking for the conservation of the 30% of the ocean surface within marine protected areas by 2030. And although the picture of the MPAs already established in the Mediterranean Sea is fairly encouraging, we should question if the current conservation effort is enough to enhance the recovery of degraded marine ecosystems, and if so, which is the time needed for marine ecosystems to naturally recover. This context relies on the opportunity to develop transplantation techniques alongside conservation efforts, which is a mean to favor and sometimes, hopefully, to accelerate the process of natural recovery. The practice of ecological restoration has experienced a continuous growth in the last decades, and it is expected to increase even more in the next years, according to the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. Most of the large-scale restoration projects included coral reefs, mangroves, kelp, forest, salt marsh, and seagrass ecosystems. The latter has been especially developed also in the Mediterranean Sea. In this presentation, I would like to summarize the most important examples, of course not an exhaustive list, but only some examples of restoration intervention on endangered species and degraded ecosystems carried out in the Mediterranean Sea. Okay, the first case is the project of restocking the Pinna nobilis population, hugely affected by a mass mortality event in 2016, but this project will be presented in detail by the colleague Saul Chiriaco later. Another European life project was recently established to reintroduce the disappeared ribbed limpet Patella ferruginea here in the Ligurian Sea, through activities of controlled reproduction never done before on the genus Patella. This project succeeded in the production of juveniles in a controlled environment. They induced the gamete emission in adults collected from the donor sites. They achieved the fertilization first, the larval development, and finally the settlement on hard substrates. And in the end, they introduced these juveniles at sea. Thus demonstrating the feasibility to reproduce endangered species in captivity. Other examples of restoration of endangered species include, for instance, the red coral, Corallium rubrum, many papers already published on this species. The various species, of course, of the gorgonians that shape animal forests in the coralligenous habitat. This is a very interesting restoration project carried out in Italy, in the area where the shipwreck of the Costa Concordia boat damaged coralligenous reefs and where the restored gorgonians were collected from fisheries by coach. Also, many restorations activities on marine sponges, for which, as you may see here, different cultivation techniques have already been tested. And alongside these interventions on endangered species, there are also many examples of restoration on degraded habitat that are experiencing, of course, dramatic decline in the Mediterranean Sea. My colleague Annalisa Falace will describe later their successful project on algal forests, while I'm spending a few more words to showing you some of the many interventions already developed for seagrass restoration. For instance, here on the fast-growing and the tolerant species Pseudosia nudosa, on both Zostera noltei and Zostera marina, usually in coastal lagoon environments, such as here the examples in the Venice lagoon, and of course on the most common Posidonia oceanica, absolutely the most studied and where the most examples of restoration activity have been carried out, because it is a very slow growing species, a sensitive species in comparison to the latters. Italy has been involved in 2017 in a LIFE project where 4 different restoration techniques have been tested in 4 different regions and transplantation sites. In the first and in the second site, what is the, okay. Okay, and in the second site, the cuttings were fixed in wire mesh supported by concrete frames. Here, in the third site, cuttings were fixed over this kind of innovative radial structures made by a biodegradable plastic. And here, large blocks of mat, 4 square meters each, were transplanted in the receiving sites. And again, always in the impacted site by the shipwrecking of the Costa Concordia and other restoration intervention aimed on Posidonia oceanica, of course, aimed to restore the damage done by the shipwrecking. And this project started in 2019. And there are actually many, many other experiments that have been settled on Posidonia oceanica with the aim to understand the best methods and the best substrate for its restoration. Here, for
Monica,
example, yes?
You have 1 more minute.
Yes, I'm going to the end.
I apologize for the time, it's running out.
No, you're right. I'm going to the final slide. So this is only an example of another substrate, artificial substrate, or the biomass in natural fibers used here. So to conclude, I would like to provide just some final remarks that come from the experience that we gained at the Mediterranean spatial scale. First of all, although the many examples of restoration, there is still today a lack of long-term monitorings. Most of them are recent in interventions, and all of them have been done at the local spatial scale. I would like also to stress on the difficulties in the permits requirements and on the need to harmonize legal aspects at both national and international levels. Even if restoration of ecosystem in the Mediterranean Sea is likely to represent a valuable tool to limit the progress of climate change, of course, we don't know anything or very few, I would say, about the effects of global warming on restoration success. Most of the restored and reintroduced species are very vulnerable to the effects of climate change, and this could reduce their survival and under the scenario of a continuous increase in temperature. And at the end, I would like to leave you with a question that can be discussed later. Considering my premises that we are still far from the achievement of the global conservation targets, is the global target of 20% of degraded ecosystem under restoration by 2030 feasible? So that's all, and thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Monica, for these experiences and information shared with us, with very pertinent conclusions at the end, and not philosophic questions at the very end. I move to my next speaker, who is online also, and who is Dr. Annalisa Falas, who is a researcher also in the Department of Life Sciences in the University of Trieste. And Annalisa will make a presentation on Rock Pop Life project on Cystoxera restoration in MPAs. So I apologize, Annalisa, but you have 8 minutes.
Okay, sorry, yes, 5 minutes can be enough for me. I will thank you for your kind invitation, and I would like to present very shortly some results obtained in the framework of our project of restoration of macroalgal forest in the Mediterranean Sea. First of all, what are the marine macroalgal forests? We refer to population of large brown macroalgae, mainly belonging to kelp, so laminariales, and Fucales species. These species are distributed all over the world in all the sea, and from the surface to the lower sublittoral. In the Mediterranean Sea, they are represented by the genus Cystoxera, which has recently been divided into 3 genera, Cystoxera gongolaria and Ericaria. The Mediterranean Sea is a very important hotspot of biodiversity for this group, hosting more than 13 species and a very great number of endemic species that we can found only in this basin. So it is very important, the Mediterranean, from this point of view. Why the marine forests are so important? Because they provide very important ecosystem function and services. First of all, as habitat forming species, they provide shelter and nursery for thousands of other species that are also of commercial interest. Like trees in a terrestrial forest, they provide oxygen and food for other species, But since we are talking now about climate, they are also important for storing blue carbon, so with important contribute in climate regulation. However, in the last 20 years, we have observed an important decline or even local extinction of this habitat in all the world, and caused by different anthropogenic impact as habitat loss, sedimentation, eutrophication, pollution, grazing, on which more recently the climate change is acting in an unpredictable way. When the marine forests disappear, they are usually replaced by species of lower structural and ecological value, with a shift from complex to very simplified habitat, with a significant loss in terms of biodiversity and productivity. So what we can do to face the decline of macroalgal forest? For sure, protection and conservation and the proper management of coastal zone are important measures to be taken on a larger scale. And several regulations have been adopted in the Mediterranean to protect Cystocera, also thanks to the active support of international organizations such as, for example, the RACSPA. But once the damage has been done, the positive impact of protection on this habitat is very low. In fact, the natural recovery of this habitat has very rarely been observed, even when the impact that caused the regression, the loss, have been removed. This is because these species have a very low dispersal ability, and it means that when zygote and embryon fall, they fall very close to the mother plants. Therefore, when they disappear from an area, it is necessary to bring them back through, for example, restoration activities. Restoration measures have been implemented, developed all over the world on a medium to large scale, and more recently also in the Mediterranean Sea. And in this context, ROCPOP has made an important contribution to the restoration of this habitat by implementing a new protocol that foresees the cultivation in the lab of the young plants that after a period of cultivation in laboratory are outplanted in the field, both in the intertidal and subtidal habitat. The method is sustainable and non-destructive and does not harm the donor population, and this is very important. These are the main results of our project. The restoration carried out during the 3 years of the project allowed us to restore about 1 kilometer of coast in the Miramare marine protected area in the Adriatic Sea in Italy, and about 650 at Cinque Terre in the Ligurian Sea, always in Italy. As a consequence of this restoration, also the ecological quality of the marine protected area greatly improved, and the method that we have implemented during this year has been shared with colleagues all around the Mediterranean Sea. The method developed in the project are now applied by several colleagues in several areas of the Mediterranean Sea. Last slide, what are the conclusions? Well, we have learned a lot, and the knowledge acquired allow us to guide the selection of where to do the restoration, how to choose the species, and the protocol to implement the action. So from this point of view, we are in a good point, but the problem now is that we have to face is the climate change, which obliges us to plan the unexpected. climate change make at the same time the restoration urgent, but limit also its feasibility, because both natural and restored population undergo the same threats. So the roadmap will force us to plan for some kind of future proofing when planning the future action by, for example, using warm water adapted genotype to restore ecosystem function. For sure, we know that we need more research to found how to understand how climate change affect marine forest, and also to better know the heat tolerance of different species. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Annalisa. You made it in, in very short time. So thank you very much for sharing this very important experience on a concrete action of restoration in a concrete place. Our last speaker is online as well, is Mr. Saul Chiriaco. I hope I pronounce well and right.
Very well, thanks.
Thank you, Saul. Saul is a VVF, WWF Miramari MPA team together with Shoreline, and he belongs to the scientific team in place in the MPA, and his presentation will focus on Pina Life project. So Saul, you have the floor, and you have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Director. Thank you all. Thank you, Director. Thank you, Atef. Thank you, Mrs. Tatiana, for the kind invitation. I will try to show you our goal in trying to restore the Pinna nobilis. But who is Pinna nobilis? Pinna nobilis is a filter feeding. It is the largest mollusk in bivalve in the Mediterranean, and it lives from 3 to 60 meters. So it has a really wide distribution in the habits. Pinna nobilis inhabits sandy seabeds and Posidonia oceanica, but also rocky and pebbles seabeds. So it is very well distributed. When the environmental conditions are optimal, it can form colonies with a lot of individuals. So we can have individuals that can live up to 50 years. So it is a very ancient species. Pinna nobilis has a lot of ecological function because it can filter a huge amount of water through the gills and traps a large quantity of phytoplankton, zooplankton, and particulates. So it acts as a real purifier of the water, improving the water quality of the habitats. You can imagine that it can filter up to 2,500 liters per day in medium individuals, 30 centimeters of individuals. So it has been suggested as a reliable bioindicator from Marine Strategy Framework Directive as a descriptor 1 and 4. Another relevant ecological function of the Pinna nobilis is related to the calcium carbonate shell, and so this is very well related to the climate change issue we are talking about today, because there are a lot of scientific evidences on the troubles with the calcium carbonate in the shells in the Mediterranean with the growing up of the temperature. It can constitute an excellent substrate for a wide variety of species. It builds 3D structures very complex with sponges, algae, and so on. And also now that the individuals are empty because the individuals are died, they can act as a real refuge for a lot of other species like fishes in the photo. During the years, the 80s, there was a big decline due to mainly anthropic threats, such as the destruction of coastal habitats, the increase of water pollution, the damages caused from the fisheries activities, of course, the anchoring, the use of the meat, of the muscular meat to be eaten, and of course, the decorative use of the pearly shells and the use of byssus to build clothes. Unfortunately, since 18, so it was included in the list of threatened species in the Annex 2 of the Barcelona Convention in 1995 and the Annex 4 in 2007. Thanks to this regime protection, in few decades we achieved a complete recovery of the species, but in 2016 we monitored a great mass mortality event that started from the western Mediterranean Sea, the Spanish coast, the Moroccan coast, and since 2016 it moved spreading all over all the Mediterranean Sea. Mortality initially was blamed only to the endoparasitic protozoan Haplosporidium pinne, but later we realized that other pathogens are linked to this mortality, such as the Mycobacterium. And this is probably the most relevant linkage to the climate-related issue, because even if the destruction of coastal habitat is, as the increase of water pollution, is an anthropic threat, the climate change has a great power to affect the spread of these new pathogens, such as the protozoan, the Mycobacterium, the Vibrio, and so on. And so it affects the good ecological quality of habitats inhabited by Pinna nobilis. So even if there is not, we are not certain that there is a direct correlation to the health status of Pinna nobilis, we know very well that there is a relationship among climate changes and ecological quality of habitats and resilience. The event starts in 2016 and now in 2022 affected all of the Mediterranean Sea. So unfortunately we have sites with more than 99% of died individuals. The project we are presenting as a lead the Regional Agency for Environmental Protection in Ligurian Sea, and as the Institute of National Biology in Slovenia, but also University from Sassari in Sardinia, in Genova in Liguria, and the Asinara National Park, and two private companies, Triton and Shoreline, who have in charge some practical and technical activities.
Saul, excuse me, I give you 2 minutes to come to the end.
To finalize. Yes, thank you very much. The scope of the project is quite narrow considering all the Mediterranean Sea, but we have 4 pilot sites: Miramare in Friuli Venezia Giulia, Italy, Strungian Park in Slovenia, Capomortola in Liguria, and Asinara in Sardinia. The project is devoted particularly to the use of sentinel bivalves in order to monitor the presence of pathogens in the project area. So before any restoration action, we have to be sure that the healthy condition of the site is achieved. So we use ecological bivalves like, as a genetic sentinel. The action foreseen are the restocking in the sites I mentioned before, the selection of individuals to be reproduced, the collection and growth of resistant individuals, and the tagging of juveniles. Of course, one of the thrilling challenges of the project is the controlled reproduction. Mentioned before by Monica, there was the success of Genova University for the reproduction of reed-bed limpet. We would like to achieve the same goal with the Pinna nobilis. The other action is the collection and transport with the production of a protocol for the collection and transport, and finally the installation of specimens in the pilot area. So, of course, finally the monitoring action to verify that the healthy conditions are sure in the receiving sites and in the donor sites, and also the monitoring of implanted juveniles together with the status of the pinna nobilis against the project impact. In our expected results, I think that the most relevant is the robust restoration protocol we want to produce, the new skill on captive maintenance that is a really challenge for now, and the skills on reproduction. And last but not least, our action as the one with SPARAC, again thanks to ATEF and the director for the support in our networking activities with non-scientific entities like SPARAC, which are very kind in inviting us in a lot of events like this one. Thanks to all for the attention.
Thanks a lot, Saul. Thanks a lot to our kind speakers, even though I a little bit persecuted them in terms of time, of course. So before to conclude, I would like to share with you the main conclusions and take-home message that I could prepare out of this session. So I will start by saying yes for our question, the initial questions. The ecosystem restoration is indeed among key tools to limit or even to reverse the progress of climate change impacts. However, climate change makes restoration an urgent need, even though it limits its feasibility at the same time, which makes things even more difficult. Ecosystem restoration has started since a few decades, and we should continue efforts to improve knowledge and our understanding while continuously monitoring ecosystems. And we should continue to guide the selection of the best sites, species, and protocols for restorations, to get long-term scale data to measure the success of restoration in the context of climate change, it's a difficult context, and plan large-scale interventions. There is a need for agreed and harmonized science-based approaches and guidelines to make the inventory of the most important ecosystems in terms of highest ecological relevance and or highest regeneration potential to ensure their successful restoration in terms of cost effectiveness and ecological sustainability, towards, of course, achieving the overall goal of 30% of conservation by 2030, even though it's questionable, but let's keep ourselves optimistic and say that we will make it all together for 2030. And thank you for your attention.